Imagine looking death in the eyeballs and saying, "Hey loser, be humble, have a seat." If you're not brave enough to stand up to death in like manner, fear not, because John Donne has already done it for us, and the proof is in this poem. Welcome back to Between the Lines. I'm your host, Adam Webb, and today we'll be reading and analyzing John Donne's Death Be Not Proud. We'll start by reading the poem. Next, we'll summarize what happens in the poem. After that, we'll go line by line and undertake a detailed analysis. And after that, we'll look at the poem's form. Finally, we'll look briefly at the themes explored in the poem. Death be not proud. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy your charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. You might have noticed some strange pronunciations in the reading. We'll get to that when we look at form later on. Alright, on to the summary. The speaker confronts death. The confrontation begins in the title, as he tells death not to be proud. He speaks to death as if it were a person, making the poem an apostrophe. The speaker, throughout his address to death, belittles death, telling it that it's not as great and ultimate as it thinks. The speaker claims that death cannot kill him, and in fact cannot kill anyone. He justifies this by saying that death is merely a sleep, buying into the Christian idea of a promised afterlife. Not only does the speaker tell death that it is ineffective at its only job, killing people, he also suggests that contrary to what death thinks, it brings nothing but pleasure to men. Humans enjoy rest and sleep, but what greater rest and sleep is there than death? The speaker continues to tell death that it is not a master as it is often understood to be, but rather a slave to chance, kings, and desperate men, the different factors that enable death. The speaker also chastises death for being in the company of disgusting and frowned upon entities such as poison, war, and sickness. Then the speaker goes on to tell death that there are other things that are more effective at making men sleep, such as poppies and charms. So death is actually overrated. The speaker then asks at the end, after seeing all this, "Why are you still so arrogant, Mr. Death?" Finally, the speaker makes the ultimate jab against death, telling it that it shall die in the end. It will have a taste of its own medicine and end up being a victim to itself. Of course, death will not have an afterlife to look forward to. So in a twist of irony, the only thing that death will effectively kill is itself. Throughout the poem, the speaker uses logic rather than emotion to argue with death. Usually, speakers who challenge death do so with dramatic and emotive language, backed by grief, sorrow, emptiness, or even acceptance. But this time, our speaker goes point by point, delivering solid evidence as he argues, explaining to death that it is not as strong as it thinks, and explaining to us readers that death is nothing to fear. The logic and composure brought by the speaker means that he can stay in control and guide the discussion to where he wants it to go. Before jumping into the poem, let us qualify and contextualize this message to death by looking briefly at who wrote it and when it was written. It was written by John Donne, a famous elegist and metaphysical poet. Metaphysical poetry usually tackles philosophical and existential issues through elaborate and sophisticated metaphors. These poems explore paradoxes and tackle questions about life and the universe, marking these poets as philosophers and intellectuals. John Donne is widely considered to be the king of metaphysical poetry, and this poem, Death Be Not Proud, is one of his most respected metaphysical poems. I mentioned also that John Donne was a famous elegist. In fact, the most famous elegist. An elegy is a song or poem that expresses sorrow or grief for one who is dead, or more loosely, a pensive, melancholic song or poem. So now we know a little bit more about the type of poetry John Donne is known for. While most of Donne's earlier works were about love and sex, his art form would eventually mature into these more contemplative and philosophical poems that focused their attention on death, spirituality, and God. In 1615, he was ordained as a priest in the Church of England and was appointed the position of royal chaplain by King James I. Let's look for a moment at how this poem, Death Be Not Proud, fits into his other works. This poem is a part of a group of poems he called the Holy Sonnet series. These poems talk about morality, religion, God, things of that nature. Death Be Not Proud was labeled Holy Sonnet 10. This kind of poetry was very important at the time. We're dealing with 17th century England here, a time and place of religious and social unrest. Only about 200 years before this were the Dark Ages, the most chaotic period in modern history. Stemming from the Dark Ages and bleeding into Donne's time was an uprising of anti-Catholicism. Being a Catholic could get you killed. John Donne was Catholic, by the way. The early 17th century also marked the return of the bubonic plague, dubbed the Black Death. This was a time and place marked by religious and social turmoil, as well as deadly diseases, topped off by violence and just general societal degeneration. The point is, Donne's voice was one that the people really wanted to hear. This poem in particular was important. Death was everywhere. People were afraid. People were uncertain of God. People welcomed the idea of disempowering death, of fearing death less. Anyhow, that was a long tangent. Let's head to the actual analysis now. Let's start, of course, with the title, Death Be Not Proud. As mentioned in the summary, the title sets up the poem to be an apostrophe, which is a type of poem or a figure of speech in which someone addresses either a dead person or a non-person. In this case, death. As long as the poem is addressed to someone or something who can't actually listen and respond, we have an apostrophe. In the same light, we can say that death is personified throughout the poem, as it is treated as if it were a person. In fact, we could say that death is anthropomorphized, actually being made into a person by the poem, instead of simply being given human characteristics. The personification of death is important to the speaker's intent. For one, personifying death automatically makes it less powerful, less mysterious, less foreign. Now we are dealing with a person, not this ominous existential monster. People tend to fear things that are not human, things that are difficult to understand, things that are not familiar to us. If death is just a human, then it's nothing to fear. Another importance of the personification of death is that it allows the speaker to ascribe human traits, particularly human flaws, onto death. Specifically, the speaker claims that death is proud. This is interesting and, in a sense, ironic, considering that pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. So death, from the onset, is promised death, seeing that it is committing a deadly sin. Not only is death proud, but it is delusional. It has a sense of misplaced or undeserved pride, a character flaw that is common amongst humans. Sometimes we feel prouder than we ought to feel. We feel overconfident and overestimate ourselves. By personifying death, the speaker can frame his address in the idea that death thinks too highly of itself and is not as strong as it thinks it is. Of course, the real intention of this is for readers to recognize that death is not so great, not so final. Death is humanized to help us disarm and demystify it. Let's head down to lines 1 and 2. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Now we get a full picture of where the speaker is coming from with this address to death. Death is proud in part because some people call it mighty and dreadful. The speaker admits that some people are terrified of death. but is telling death that this is no reason for it to be so proud. Now that the speaker has acknowledged that some people do fear death, he will need to justify why such people are wrong or foolish. He will need to use some kind of logic to explain why his perspective on death is more correct than theirs. The two adjectives used to capture some people's fear of death are quite comprehensive. Some people call death mighty because it can easily defeat even the strongest, wealthiest, and wisest of men. It is seen as an ultimate and final force, one for which there is no counter, no cure. By the way, lines 1 and 2 tell us who the real audience of the poem is. Is the speaker talking to death? Yes, as he addresses death personally. But he's also preaching to the some mentioned in line 2. He wants to convince those who fear death that death is really nothing to fear. Before we move on to the next couple of lines, take note of the speaker's tone thus far. This tone will continue throughout the poem. The speaker is authoritative and confident in how he speaks. He assumes such great authority that he takes on the task of humbling death. Look at how resolute and assertive the end of line 2 is. For thou art not so. Look at how the poem opens with a bold, unwavering command to death. Death, be not proud. Another thing to notice is that by using an apostrophe as a means to discuss death, the speaker sets up a one-way discussion. Death must sit and listen. But not being an actual person, it cannot respond to defend itself. The speaker personifies death, but only where it benefits him, the speaker. Death can listen but cannot speak. This is another way in which personification is used to take the power away from death. The speaker, and not death, is who will have the final say in this discussion. Because frankly, he is the one who has the only say in this discussion. Let's move down to the next two lines. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. You might immediately notice the capitalization of death in line 4. This will continue as death is personified throughout the poem. Now, death is more a name than a concept. In these lines, the speaker gives the first and most important reason for why death should not be proud. Those who death thinks that it overthrows, that it kills, do not actually die. So death only thinks it is killing people. How can those who die not die? We have encountered something of a paradox here for the moment, but that will unravel itself as we move forward. We see that the speaker does not intend to deny the existence of death. That would be illogical, as the speaker cannot talk to something that he doesn't think is real. Rather, the speaker is redefining death. He's trying to reshape our idea of death and death's idea of itself. We see here that the speaker is telling death that this power it thinks it has is just an illusion, or better yet, a delusion, one fed by the unwarranted fear that some people have of death. Before we look closely at line 4, we must take note at a glaring word from line 3. Why would the speaker use the word overthrow? It is of course to support the idea that death lives in a delusion of grandeur. Who is it that typically overthrows? Kings, great men, great armies. Death thinks of itself as being great and mighty, as one who does not merely kill, but conquers. The speaker is highlighting how highly death thinks of itself, and challenging the idea that death should be seen as great. Another interesting thing about line 3 is the alliterated th sound. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow. Usually, this soft alliteration conveys some kind of tenderness or gentleness. Here, it sonically supports the notion that death is not as strong, not as monstrous as it thinks it is, and as others make it out to be. Instead of a titan or dragon, death is more of an insect. Now we reach the patronizing poor death. The tone here is not just one of superiority over death, but one of pity for death, one of mockery, more accurately. He mocks death for living in the delusion of power, for thinking it is strong when it's actually weak, for hyping itself up when it needs to be humble. The poor death is also used to reinforce to the reader that they should not fear death. If anything, we should pity death. We should pity death for being weak and delusional. The second part of line 4 is critical. Nor yet canst thou kill me. First, the speaker spoke of death's incompetence in general terms. Now, the speaker talks about his personal immunity to death, stating that death cannot kill him. This feeling of imperviousness to death is what gives the speaker the confidence and even pompousness to tackle death head on. He's not afraid of death because death cannot kill him. Even when he physically dies, he can look forward to living once more, and this time for eternity. Considering who John Donne was, we can easily assume that his confidence lay in his Christian belief of a promised resurrection. Look at the word yet. It might appear as if the speaker is admitting that death will kill him at some future time. But yet here is used poetically and instead means something to the effect of still or even now. It is used simply to emphasize the currentness of death's powerlessness. It's not as if death was or will be powerless. Death is powerless. Death is yet powerless. With the first 4 lines wrapped up, we're largely finished with the claim of the poem. The rest of the poem will go on to defend the claim that death is powerless. Lines 5 to 6. From rest and sleep which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. Line 5 is an incomplete thought, but let us look at it by itself for the moment. From rest and sleep which but thy pictures be. The meaning is, rest and sleep are pictures of death. In other words, we can get a good picture, a good image, a good sense of what death is by comparing it to rest and sleep. We can imagine rest and sleep to be copies, replicas, pictures, as it were, of death. Also, when someone is dead, they appear as if they are resting or sleeping. Are rest and sleep things that we humans fear? For most people, no. In fact, rest and sleep are natural for us. Furthermore, they are enjoyable and beneficial. This is how we should view death, as merely a rest, a reprieve from work and activity. The speaker by now has pushed his argument against death even further. Not only is death something we should not fear, but something we should embrace. By comparing death to rest and sleep, the speaker employs a very familiar and very Christian euphemism. Even Jesus himself described death as but a sleep. This can be seen as a biblical allusion. Note that the thought from line 5 is completed by the first part of line 6. From rest and sleep, but with thy pictures be much pleasure. The speaker is simply saying that humans get much pleasure from rest and sleep, and these pleasureful activities are similar to death. It would therefore obtain that death brings much pleasure. However, with the latter part of line 6, the speaker goes even further than that. He says, from thee much more must flow. In other words, if we can gain pleasure from resting and sleeping, then it follows that we will gain even more pleasure from dying, considering that death is just a deeper kind of sleep or rest. Look at the logical structure of the argument posed in these 2 lines. It's a straightforward, rational, if A then B sort of argument. The speaker is maintaining his composure and sense of logic. He says, if sleep and rest, which are pictures of death, bring us pleasure, then obviously death must bring us even more pleasure. Look at the word must in line 6. This is an imperative statement, a statement of certainty, of simple fact. Later, when we analyze the poem's form, we will take note of the caesuras and enjambments used throughout the poem. But the caesura in line 6 demands immediate attention. The midline break in the form of a semicolon forces us to take a short break while reading. This break is noticeable because most lines do not contain caesuras. The caesura here, the forced pause, is a reference to the rest and sleep mentioned. It is interesting to think that if life were a poem, death would be merely a caesura. Take note of the alliterated sound in line 6. This sonic repetition may connect with the abundance of pleasure that must flow from death. The alliteration starts with much at the beginning of the line and finishes off with much more must flow, bringing emphasis to how much pleasure death must bring. Furthermore, the repeated sound mimics the sound we make as we eat something delicious. Perhaps death brings us a similar sense of satisfaction. Adding to this is the repetition of much within the line, further highlighting just how much pleasure we can expect to receive from death. This line also contains some assonance at the end, those long vowel sounds. Then from thee much more must flow. The restfulness and calmness of the assonance also underscore how blissful death must be. Note how the speaker has switched from simply disarming death to now flat out praising it. Surely this praise is being given to death ironically. The speaker does not actually think highly of death, but is merely belittling it by congratulating it for doing the opposite of what it tries to do. Death tries to bring great pain, but the speaker is thanking it for bringing great pleasure. Line 7. And soonest our best men with thee do go. This line is straightforward. It posits that the best people die early. Death is therefore a reward, perhaps given by God to those who are most righteous. For the best men in line 7, death is about leaving this sinful world and being on your way to paradise. The sooner the better. Since death brings much pleasure and is a reprieve from this troublesome world, it would make sense that God would grant death unto the best men soonest. Note that death does not forcibly take these men. Death does not overthrow them. Instead, these men go with death. Look at the word with. These men welcome death and go with it voluntarily. In fact, they use death as a transit to enter the afterlife, as we will see in the next line. These men have power over death, and not the other way around. Line 8. Rest of their bones and souls delivery. In line 7, we see that the best men soonest go with death. Here in line 8, we get some information on what it means to accompany or to be accompanied by death. Death brings rest to men's bones. The bones here, in a sense, may be literal, as bones are what remain after the body decays. Through death, the bones are given rest, and they are no longer moving and working within a body. However, the bones here are also a synecdoche, as in a sense, they represent not only the bones, but the entire bodies, the physical existence of men. Death gives sweet and well-deserved rest to our tired bodies. We see that death gives rest to the body, but does it also give rest to the soul? Not so. Death is not powerful enough to make the soul rest. Instead, death delivers the soul. To where does death deliver the soul? Of course, to the afterlife. Specifically in the case of the best men, to heaven. The idea of death delivering the soul is the foundation of the speaker's entire argument against death. The fact is, when death comes, one is not erased, but merely transported. So, while death thinks it is a destroyer, an overthrower, it is nothing more than a glorified deliverer. Look at how death is depicted in the line. It brings rest and delivers the soul. Death is a friend to us, not an enemy. In fact, we may go as far as to say that death is a servant to us. It comes to us and gives us rest, and it even delivers a package for us. The speaker is saying, it is ridiculous to fear someone who treats us so kindly, even though death believes that it is a dreadful and terrible force. The speaker is providing the perspective that even though it tries to be dreadful and terrible, it only has the power to do us favors. Take a closer look at the word delivery. We have a very clever pun here. According to the speaker, death here on earth, at least for the righteous men mentioned in the previous line, marks the beginning of true life, the beginning of eternal life. Delivery is the act of giving birth. Death is doing the exact opposite of what it thinks it does. At death, we are born. Line 9. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. The speaker continues to belittle and ridicule death. In the previous line, he made death out to be a servant. Now, death is reduced to being a slave. It is a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. In other words, death has no power on its own, no autonomy, no free will even. Instead, it is wielded, dominated, and controlled by these four masters. Let us look at these four masters. First, death is a slave to fate. This means a person will die only when they are fated or meant to die. It is not in death's power to decide when it comes for a person. That decision is made by fate, who orders death around. The second slave master is chance, which in a sense is the opposite of fate. People often die by chance, luck, happenstance. A terrible accident, a bolt of lightning, any random event can trigger a death. In this way, death works under the command of chance and not on its own volition. It is important to realize that fate and chance are opposites because it shows the wide range of slave masters that death has. Before we touch on the other two masters of death, take note of the assonance that tightly connects the words slave, fate, chance. Thou art slave to fate, chance. The assonance not only groups the three words, but forces us to spend longer on them as we read. Perhaps this is done to build some anticipation, as we wait just a little bit longer before getting to the other masters of death. This makes sense as the other two masters of death are of particular interest to the speaker, being humans. On to the next slave master of death. Kings. Kings back in the day of John Donne had the power to command executions. Instead of just being ceremonial figures as they are today, royalty back in the day could actually have people killed, and quite easily. So in the case of a king having someone killed, it is the king and not death who is in control. Death is therefore a slave to the king. Also, when a king declares war, many deaths occur. These deaths happen not by death's action, but by the king's command. Notice how this master is a human. Even the very people death is trying to dominate is a master to it. And finally, we have the fourth slave master, desperate men. A desperate man is a dangerous man. Men who are desperate might commit murder or suicide. In their desperation, they can become a master, a wielder of death. See how not only kings, but even regular men can dominate and use death. Look at how these four masters of death are ordered. They are ordered fate, chance, kings, desperate men. They are ordered based on rank, based on their level of renown and might. Of these four, the first is fate. Fate is a mysterious and renowned force, often connected to God or some kind of universal order. Fate by nature is inevitable. Then we have chance, which is essentially luck, randomness. Chance might not be as powerful as fate, but it's still extremely powerful. It is unpredictable, unreadable. It shows up at any time, anywhere, every time, everywhere. Next, we have the human masters. First, we have the kings who are great. Then we have desperate men who can be seen as despicable, or at least lowly compared to the other masters. Why order the masters of death in this way, from most to least powerful? The speaker does this to incrementally degrade death, to show as the list goes on that death is really a slave to everything and everyone, from the greatest to the smallest. We all have power over death. Line 10. And dust with poison, war, and sickness dwell. The speaker continues to attack death's character by now talking about the loathsome company it keeps. Death is said to dwell with poison, war, and sickness, which are all considered revolting, disgusting. So the friends of death are basically the scum of the world. Furthermore, though it is not stated, by logic of the previous line, these elements with which death dwells are also masters of death. Even the friends that death hangs out with are bossing it around. Lines 11 and 12. And popular charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then? The speaker continues to demean death by telling us that it is not the only one who can make us sleep. In fact, other things can do that even more effectively than death can. Back in lines 5 and 6, the speaker mentioned that death is like a sleep, and so we should expect to get pleasure from it. While the speaker now continues this comparison between death and sleep, he posits that poppy or charms are even better at making us sleep. Poppy seeds were refined to make opium, a narcotic drug that could induce deep sleep, whereas charms refer to magic spells and artifacts that could be used to cause people to either literally sleep or actually die. So if sleep is what we want, we have better alternatives to death. Essentially, death can only do one thing, and it isn't even the best at that one thing. In line 12, the speaker says that poppy and charms are better than the stroke of death, or the touch of death. Look at what the touch of death is called. A stroke. A stroke is a gentle touch, a petting, caressing movement. Just as in the previous line, death is painted to be a weak, meek force, as opposed to the mighty giant it is more often seen as. We then have an obvious caesura in the middle of line 12, which gives both Death and us some time to reflect on the fact that Death is essentially powerless. The speaker pauses almost to give Death a chance to respond, but then continues with, "Why swell'st thou then?" In other words, seeing that you are not even the best at what you do, why are you so proud? Why is your head so swelled with pride? Why are you so puffed up? This rhetorical question reinforces the title and opening line. Look at how lines 10, 11, 12, and also 7 open with "and." This kind of repetition is called an anaphora. The anaphora across these 4 lines gives the impression that there's a long list of reasons, a large bank of evidence to support the speaker's argument that Death is powerless and pathetic. Line 13. One short sleep past, we wake eternally. In line 13, not only is Death asleep, but a short sleep. If Death were better at its job, the sleep might have been longer. After that short sleep, we wake eternally. This line supports the previously mentioned idea that Death is simply the gateway into the afterlife. Look at how short the words in this line are, 1 syllable each, with the exception of the final word, which is relatively long, eternally. This mirrors how short the sleep of Death is and how long eternity is in comparison. And this contrast between the short sleep and the eternal wakefulness further proves that the pause that Death brings is insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And the final line, "And death shall be no more, death thou shalt die." We come to the conclusion, the final nail in Death's coffin, so to speak. At the end, death shall be no more. The caesura in the line causes for a long reflective pause and punctuates these 2 powerful statements with a moment of silence. As promised in the Bible, "Death thou shalt die." The last line alludes to scriptures like Corinthians 15:26, which states that death will be destroyed. The alliterated "d" sound over the line brings across a sonic force, a power, a beat to the speaker's voice, and an added certainty to the death of Death. The ending of the poem is paradoxical, as it is Death who will overcome death. The final victim of Death will be Death itself. Now Death, after hearing the speaker's argument, must now live in the same expectant fear that it has caused countless men to live with over the millennia. The speaker looks forward to the day when Death shall die. The promise of Death's death and the promise of eternal life are what enable the speaker to stand so boldly against death. Let's look at the poem's form. This section assumes that you have basic knowledge of poetic form. You can watch the short lessons linked in the video description to get a feel of what poetic form is all about. The information in those lessons will help you to make sense of this part of this analysis. Moving on. The most obvious and the most important observation is that this poem is a sonnet. While there are some deliberate deviations, the form is close to that of a Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. One of the most important functions of this sonnet's form is that it lends itself to the familiar outline of a question or problem in the first section and an answer or solution in the second section. Typically, the first section is an octet, meaning 8 lines, while the second section is a sestet, 6 lines. Usually this first section has a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, B, B, A, which can be seen as 2 quatrains of enclosed rhymes. This is usually followed by the sestet with a rhyme scheme of C, D, C, D, C, D, which are 6 lines of alternate rhymes. Look at Death Be Not Proud. We see that the octet has the usual rhyme scheme. However, the sestet, instead of having a scheme of C, D, C, D, C, D, has a rhyme scheme of C, D, D, C, E, E. That's a little suspicious. We'll get back to it a bit later. In John Donne's time, eternally was pronounced eternali, and therefore rhymed with die. Why did John Donne use this pattern instead of the regular pattern? Remember, the first part of the poem usually presents some kind of question or problem, while the second part usually provides a solution or answer. The rhyming patterns, the aforementioned enclosed rhymes and alternate rhymes, are what mark the confines of each section. Therefore, since Donne changes the rhyme scheme, we have to reassess the poem to see where the sections separate, as it will not be in the usual place. It turns out that this poem, instead of having one section of 8 lines and another section of 6 lines, has a very long first section of 12 lines and a very short second section of only 2 lines. How do we know this? The first 12 lines have the following rhyme scheme: ABBA, ABBA, CDDC. This is clearly one section, made up of 3 quatrains of enclosed rhymes instead of just 2. Then we have the second section, which is a rhyming couplet. This pattern does not follow the rules of the Petrarchan sonnet. In the first section of 12 lines, the problem of the speaker is an argumentative one. He sets out to convince Death that it should not be proud. And he sets out to convince us, the readers, that Death is not as powerful as we think. He gives many supporting details for his argument, and wraps up this long first section with a poignant rhetorical question to Death. One that essentially says, "After all the evidence that I have presented, do you still not see my point?" This rhetorical question marks the poem's volta, the turning point where we move from the first to the second section. The second section of this sonnet is as much a conclusion as it is an answer. These final 2 lines give us the underpinning validity for the entire argument of the speaker, the underlying fact on which everything stands. After one short sleep, we wake eternally. Death is temporary. The scary thing about death is that we see it as definitive, ultimate, permanent. But in line 13, we see that it is not. In line 1, the speaker tells us, "Death be not proud." In line 13, we see why. In line 2, the speaker says, "Death is not mighty and dreadful." In line 13, we see why. In line 3, the speaker says that death does not overthrow anyone. In line 13, we see why, and so on. Then in line 14, we get not only a conclusion to the entire argument, but a conclusion to death itself, a resolute fact that shuts down all opposition to the speaker's argument and further demolishes whatever little chance death stood of winning this debate. Not only is death temporary, but it is mortal. It is here only for a time. While we can go on living forever, death is the one who must die. We've covered the rhyme scheme and the stanzaic arrangement. Next, we must look at the poem's meter. As you should know, we are expecting to see the iambic pentameter throughout the poem. Ta-dum, 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 ta-dum. Ta-dum, 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 ta-dum. You will see that the iambic pentameter is kept for the most part, broken in only 2 lines. It may appear as if the pattern might be broken in line 1, but called was pronounced called back in the day, giving us all 10 syllables. I will reread the poem. Pay special attention to lines 9 and 11. Those lines cannot be read in the iambic pentameter. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest off their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy your charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more, death thou shalt die. In both lines 9 and 11, the speaker is listing different things, compiling evidences to support his argument. In line 9, he lists out the masters of death. In line 11, he lists things that can do death's job better than it can. These 2 lines break the iambic flow by adding extra syllables, creating the effect of the reader stumbling over the lines because of the excess of syllables. The iambic pentameter gives us a moderate mouthful per line, allowing for a smooth and musical reading. But with these 2 lines, we are forced to extend the usual time we take to read a line. The poet does this to add much emphasis to just how many pieces of evidence he has to support his arguments against death. The lists are so long that they take up too much space, and cause the lines to be too long. The iambic pentameter simply cannot constrain or restrict the abundance of evidence the speaker has that death is powerless. There's one more thing we'll look at under the poem's form. We'll look at the caesuras and enjambments. The poem has 3 caesuras, 3 hard midline pauses, and 2 enjambments, 2 lines that run into their succeeding line in order to complete the phrase or clause they started. First, we look at the enjambments. The first one happens in line 1. Line 1 by itself does not make sense, but needs to flow to the comma in line 2. Of course, lines 1 and 2 say, "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so." The enjambment takes some of the weight of the word mighty. While it is the first word of line 2, because it is coming from an enjambment, the reader says it quickly and moves on, not giving it quite as much credence as one usually gives the first word in a line. This works to add a de-emphasis to the might, to the perceived might of death. The second enjambment happens in line 3 and has a similar purpose as the previous one. Look at this. "For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death." Emphasis is removed from overthrow, as the reader, instead of pausing at the end of the line, must rush on to "die not" to finish the thought. This is because death doesn't really overthrow anyone. Instead, we should focus on the "die not," the powerlessness of death. The first caesura happens in line 6. As previously mentioned, this one gives the reader rest as they pause in the line. The pleasure gained from rest and sleep, and ultimately from death, is felt by the reader. Next is the caesura in line 12. As we pause here, we can reflect on just how useless death is. Also, the pause adds weight and dramatic tension to the rhetorical question that follows. The final caesura is in line 14. It provides a pause for contemplation and a break in the reading and adds weight to the 2 parts of the conclusion in the final line. With the constraints of a sonnet, the poet could not add a 15th line to make each of these powerful phrases get a line of its own. The caesura fixes this problem as we are forced to consider the points both on their own and in tandem. Furthermore, the caesura adds a strong dramatic pause as the speaker ends his speech in a profound and pointed manner. There is, however, another function of the caesura, and a very clever one. This function is carried out alongside the decapitalization of the first instance of death in the line. Is death still not being personified? Why isn't it capitalized in "and death shall be no more"? The answer to that question must also acknowledge that death is again capitalized after the caesura in "death thou shalt die." Is death written with the common D to unperson death? To lexicographically strip him of all power and dignity? To show how dead it really is? While that is a romantic thought, it is not a very valid one, because death is again capitalized after the caesura. The speaker would certainly not re-empower death right at the end of the poem. The reasons for the common, then capital D, as well as one reason for the caesura, is also a reason why the poem seems to end with 2 hard, conclusive sentiments. "And death shall be no more. Death thou shalt die." These seem like 2 endings, each wanting to be the line remembered by all. To solve this intriguing riddle of the final line, the riddle of the common then capital D, the riddle of the caesura, the riddle of the double conclusion, one simply needs to consider the audience of the poem, the addressee of the poem. Is this address meant for death or for us? Well, both. And therefore, the poem needs a conclusion for death and one for us. "And death shall be no more." That conclusion is for humans. The common D depersonifies death because the speaker is not speaking to death here. Another proof of this is that the speaker has been speaking to death directly in first person all along. Why would he suddenly switch to third person? He didn't. He is now speaking to us. He is assuring us that death shall be no more. So it's not a matter of the speaker switching from first to third person, it's a matter of the speaker switching who he's talking to. The caesura then closes off the address to us and moves on to the second closing argument, which is meant for death, as is now obvious by the capitalized D and the direct first person thou. Death thou shalt die. He's telling death directly that it shall die. And with that, we have conducted a satisfactory examination of this poem's form. having looked at its stanzaic structure, rhyme scheme, meter, and the deliberate irregularities of its rhythm brought forth by the enjambments and caesuras. Finally, let's look at some major themes explored by the poem, very briefly. First, death. Death is the most important theme of this poem, particularly the powerlessness of death and the urge to reshape our perspective of death. The speaker spends the entire poem telling death to humble itself, because it is not actually mighty at all. In the same breath, the speaker preaches to us to renounce our fear of death on the grounds that death is merely a sleep that transitions us to the afterlife. The speaker disempowers death by humanizing it, by comparing it to sleep and rest, by saying that death brings pleasure instead of pain, by saying that death is temporary, by telling us that death is a slave rather than a master, by telling us the despicable company that death keeps, by telling us that death is outdone by poppies and charms, and by promising that death will eventually die. A solid and comprehensive argument, if you ask me. Next theme, God and religion. The basis of the speaker's argument against death is the eternal life promised by God. Because the speaker looks forward to eternal life, impending death is seen as nothing to fear, as it does not actually mark the end of life, but rather the beginning. The comparison of death to sleep, the mention of the promise of eternal life after death, and the conclusion that death will die are all references to Christian ideologies. Other religions have these ideologies as well, but considering the background of the poet, it is safe to say that the influence for these ideologies were from his Christian beliefs. In short, God is victor over death and has made us victors over death as well. Next theme, appearance versus reality. While death appears to be terrible and final, while it seems to be man's greatest enemy, the reality, according to the speaker, is that death cannot harm us, but can only provide us with rest and reprieve, and more importantly, with transit into the afterlife. While the appearance is that death has power over man, the reality is that man has power over death. Okay, next theme, power and powerlessness. Death thinks that it is powerful. Its pride stems from its thought that it can overthrow men. It also feels proud because people fear it. However, the speaker argues that man has power over death, and that death is actually powerless to hurt man, able only to bring rest and deliver us into the afterlife. With that, our examination of Death Be Not Proud is complete. If you have any thoughts or questions, leave them in the comment section and I'll be sure to respond. And as always, thanks for watching.